One of the things I spoke about in my previous podcast, the illusion of adoption matrix, was how organizations often convince themselves that activity equals adoption. If users are logging in, completing fields, attending training sessions, generating reports, leadership naturally assumes the transformation is working. But underneath those matrices is often a much deeper issue hiding in plain sight. And that issue is the relationship businesses have with people doing change. Because if you spend enough time around large transformation programs, especially in the Salesforce world, you start to notice a pattern. Organizations are incredibly willing to invest in technology. They invest in platforms, integrations, automation, AI functionality, consultants, architects, and redesign projects without any hesitation. Yet the moment the conversation turns toward training, enablement, behavioral support, reinforcement, or long-term adoption, the energy in the room changes completely. Suddenly, budgets become tighter, questions become sharper. Leaders start asking whether all of this support is actually really necessary. And I think that tells us something really important. Most organizations still fundamentally believe that technology is the primary driver for transformation. People are treated as secondary considerations that simply need to catch up once the system is live. The assumption is often that if the platform is good enough, modern enough, or intuitive enough, users will naturally adapt themselves around it. But human beings simply don't work that way. Technology is predictable, human behavior isn't. That's why executives so often overestimate technology and underestimate people. Technology feels measurable, controllable. You can see it being built. You can demonstrate features in a boardroom. You can show implementation milestones, delivery plans, architecture diagrams. You can physically point to the progress. Human adoption, on the other hand, is far more difficult to measure because it's emotional, behavioral, and deeply connected to confidence, habits, trust, and psychology. The irony is that the human side transformation is usually far more important than technology itself, yet it releases only a tiny fraction of this attention. I've seen organizations spend months designing technically impressive Salesforce environments. Endless workshops take place around future state processes, automation opportunities, reporting structures, AI roadmaps, integrations, paid layouts, and governance models. Huge amounts of intellectual effort go into building something strategically powerful. But then, somewhere near the end of the project, there's almost a sudden realization the users will need training. As though adoption is simply the final task before go live, rather than one of the central, fundamental pillars holding the entire transformation together. And this is where so many businesses misunderstand the role of training. Great training is not simply showing users where buttons live or explaining which fields need to be completed. Real enablement is far more complex than that. A great trainer is helping people rebuild confidence inside a completely new operational environment. They help users navigate uncertainty, help experienced employees adapt long-established habits. They're helping individuals move through the uncomfortable feeling of no longer being experts in their own daily work. That emotional dimension is almost always underestimated by leadership teams. When executives look at transformation, they often see opportunity, efficiency, innovation, and strategic improvement. But users frequently experience something very different. They experience disruption, they experience pressure, the fear of making mistakes publicly. They start worrying about their performance targets, about looking slow or incompetent in front of their colleagues. In some cases, they worry about whether the technology is quietly preparing to replace parts of their role altogether, or maybe their role completely. These concerns are rarely spoken about openly during projects, but they exist underneath the surface of almost every major transformation program. You can often feel it during training sessions. Some users become quiet and withdrawn. Others become defensive and overly critical. Some disengage entirely, while others appear frustrated by similar small details. Leadership teams can sometimes label these individuals as resistant or difficult, but many of them are simply trying to protect their confidence and stability inside an environment that suddenly feels completely unfamiliar. Interestingly, the most experienced employees can sometimes struggle the most during these large system changes. That sounds counterintuitive because we naturally assume experienced staff will just adapt quickly. But experience is often built on years of operational muscle memory. Confidence comes from repetition. Speed comes from familiarity. Reputation comes from expertise. When a business introduces a new system, especially one with redesigned processes, it can temporarily destabilize the very people the organization depends on most heavily. And this is where the gap between leadership perception and operational reality starts becoming dangerous. Executives usually experience technology through dashboards, demonstrations, strategic meetings, and implementation updates. Users experience technology through friction. They experience additional clicks during busy days, confusing processes under pressure, unclear workflows, and systems that may technically make sense but operationally feel very unnatural. Leadership see transformation. Users often just feel interruption. That disconnect matters enormously, because once leadership becomes detached from the day-to-day operational experience of users, organizations begin making very flawed assumptions about adoption. Silence becomes mistaken for success. Attendance becomes mistaken for engagement. System access becomes mistaken for confidence. Completion rates becomes mistaken for capability. But users are remarkably good at surviving systems, even the ones they don't truly believe in. That's one of the hidden truths of enterprise technology. Employees adapt just enough for function. They learn enough to avoid problems. They complete the minimum required processes. They attend the sessions. They log into the platform. They follow just enough of the rules to appear compliant. And from a reporting perspective, everything can look perfectly healthy, while frustration quietly builds underneath. This is exactly why metrics alone are so dangerous, and why the previous podcast about adoption metrics connects so closely to this conversation. Metrics can show activity, but they cannot fully show confidence. They cannot fully show trust, usability, emotional buy-in, or long-term behavioral commitment. Those things are much harder to measure, but they're often the true indicator of whether transformation will succeed over time. What makes this even more interesting is that the organization frequently interprets technology complexity as maturity. The more automation, customization, and functionality added into a platform, the more impressive the system appears to be at leadership level. But users experience that complexity very different. Every additional process, every extra screen, every mandatory field, every layered workflow, all add cognitive weight to someone's day. Over time, that's creates what I describe as cognitive debt. Not technical debt, but human mental overload created by increasingly complex operational environments. And the dangerous thing about cognitive debt is that it accumulates quietly. Leaderships might celebrate sophisticated functionality, whilst users slowly become exhausted by the sheer effort required to navigate the platform efficiently. In those moments, people naturally begin creating workarounds. They might revert back to spreadsheets. They might avoid fields that feel unnecessary. They can start bypass processes they don't fully understand. And none of it happens because users are lazy or unwilling. It happens because human beings naturally move towards reducing friction in their working environment. And that's precisely why good enabled professionals are so important. The best trainers sit between two worlds. They understand the technology, but they also understand human behavior. They recognize where processes feel unnatural. They notice where terminology becomes confusing. They identify where workflows clash with real operational reality. Often they're spotting problems long before leadership teams become aware of them. More importantly, great trainers create psychological safety. And that's something businesses massively underestimate. People learn differently when they feel safe to ask questions. They absorb information differently when they're not worried about judgment or embarrassment. Confidence changes learning outcomes dramatically. A stressed or overwhelmed user processes information very differently to somebody who feels supported and psychologically secure. Yet many training plans are still designed almost entirely around content delivery rather than behavioral readiness. Organizations proudly announce that training has been delivered because sessions took place, recordings were uploaded, and documentation exists. But none of these things automatically means people feel capable, supported, or confident in their new environment. And honestly, this is why I believe training should never be viewed as the final phase of a project. Great trainers implement projects long before delivery begins. They challenge process designs. They identify operational risk. They ask whether workflows actually make sense for real people under real pressure. We bring a perspective that technical teams sometimes overlook because they're constantly thinking about the day-to-day human experience behind the system. Questions such as, will users realistically understand why this matters? Or does this process align with how people actually work? Are often just as important as technical design decisions themselves. Because ultimately, implementation and integration are not the same thing. Implementation is deploying technology. Integration is embedding behavior. One is technical, the other is human. And human integration takes significantly longer than most businesses expect. It requires reinforcement, communication, leadership visibility, coaching, patience, and operational honesty. It also requires organizations to accept that when users struggle, the problem is not automatically the users themselves. Sometimes the process is flawed. Sometimes communication was poor. Sometimes the rollout was rushed, and sometimes the design ignored operational reality. And sometimes businesses simply underestimate how exhausting behavioral change can be for a large group of people trying to maintain performance while simultaneously relearning how they work on a day-to-day basis. I think this conversation becomes even more important now that AI is being attached to almost every business strategic decision. Once again, organizations are becoming fascinated by technological capabilities. AI co-pilots, automated summaries, predictive recommendations, intellectual workflows all sound incredibly attractive. Some of them generally are valuable, but underneath excitement, the same foundational issues still exist. If users already struggle with trust, confidence, usability, process understanding, or platform engagement, layering AI on top of this doesn't automatically solve these problems. In many cases, it amplifies them. Businesses cannot automate their way out of weak adoption foundations. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable question many organizations now need to ask themselves. Are they investing in technology because it genuinely helps people work better? Or because technology feels easier to buy than behavioral change? Because behavioral transformation is incredibly difficult. It requires leadership maturity. It requires consistency. It requires humility. It forces organizations to acknowledge that successful transformation has never really been about systems alone. It's always been about the people. Technology is simply the tool. The organization that truly understands it usually behave very differently during projects. They do not treat enablement as a side activity. They do not see training as support function that happens near go live. They recognize that confidence, clarity, usability, and communication and reinforcement are strategic business priorities because they understand something many businesses still overlook. People are not the barrier to transformation. People are the transformation. And interestingly, when organizations generally invest in people properly, the technology starts to perform better as well. Adoption will improve. Data quality will improve. Process consistency will improve. Reporting improves. User confidence will spike. Return on investment improves. Not because the technology changed, but because the relationship between the people and the technology changed. That might actually be the most important lesson in all of this. Executives often believe transformation is primarily about systems, platforms, and innovation. But the longer you work around large implementations, the more you realize successful transformation is really about understanding human beings, how they think, how they learn, how they react to pressure, and how they adapt to change. Technology simply exposes how one organization understands its people. And perhaps it's a real continuation of the conversation from the previous podcast. Adoption metrics can only ever show visible activity. They cannot fully show confidence, or trust, or emotional engagement, or the belief in the system itself. Yet those human factors are often the true foundation of long-term success. So maybe the better question for leadership teams is no longer, did we implement the platform successfully? But maybe the real question should be, did our people generally become stronger because of it? Because if the answer to that question is no, then eventually even the best technology in the world will begin struggling under the weight of human disengagement.